Rain streaked down the tall windows of the battalion operations building at Fort Bragg, washing the early morning light into a dull gray smear. Officers and senior NCOs moved through the corridor with quiet urgency, folders tucked under their arms, tablets casting faint glows across their faces as they funneled toward the main briefing room. The air carried that familiar blend of coffee, damp fabric, and barely contained tension. Captain Claire Harmon arrived exactly on time, uniform pressed, boots polished, expression composed. She shifted the leather notebook in her hand, the one she had filled past midnight, and moved toward the door. A staff officer stepped sideways to block her path. "Ma'am, this meeting is restricted to command staff only." Her voice stayed level. "I was on the distribution list." He avoided her eyes and replied with something close to apology. It must have been included by mistake. The door closed with a soft, final click. Inside, the briefing began, voices muffled behind glass. A junior lieutenant glanced up, caught her eyes for a second, then dropped his gaze back to his slides. Fluorescent lights hummed. Boots echoed past without stopping. Claire stood alone in the hallway, notebook pressed to her chest, listening to the rhythm of a meeting she was prepared to lead but not permitted to enter. She wasn't excluded for being late. She was excluded because they didn't believe she belonged at the table. Before we go further, make sure to subscribe to Old Bill's Tales so you never miss these true stories of courage. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Captain Claire Harmon was 32, the battalion logistics officer at Fort Bragg, home of the 82nd Airborne Division. On paper, her position placed her at the center of everything that kept the unit moving. Fuel, ammunition, vehicles, rations, repair cycles, accountability. In practice, it often placed her just outside the spotlight. She hadn't started her Army career as an officer. At 19, she enlisted as a supply specialist, learning the weight of crates before she ever understood the weight of responsibility. Those early years shaped her more than any classroom could. She learned to inventory by touch in the dark, to read maintenance logs like weather forecasts, and to listen carefully when senior NCOs described what units actually needed versus what they claimed they needed. After her second deployment, she applied for officer candidate school. She graduated without ceremony, pinned her bars quietly, and returned to the same world she had once navigated from the motor pool floor. Afghanistan was where she earned her reputation, though few at Fort Bragg knew the full story. As a convoy commander, she pushed supplies through narrow roads carved between mountains and villages where silence often meant danger. Her Bronze Star came after an ambush outside Kunar Province, when an IED disabled the lead vehicle and small arms fire pinned the convoy in place. Claire reorganized the trucks under fire, redistributed ammunition, coordinated aerial overwatch, and evacuated a wounded specialist without losing a single additional soldier. She never mentioned it. In the battalion, logistics was often called rear support, language people used when they wanted to sound respectful without actually valuing the role. Infantry captains talked about ranges, field problems, and maneuver exercises. Claire talked about fuel burn rates, maintenance cycles, and contingency stock levels. She didn't raise her voice in meetings. She didn't lean back or laugh loudly at jokes meant to signal confidence. She spoke when she had something necessary to say, and when she finished, she folded her hands neatly on the table, as if daring anyone to challenge the numbers she had already memorized. Compared to the infantry officers around her, she was physically smaller, her frame compact beneath her uniform. Some mistook that for fragility. They never noticed how still she stood. Claire arrived at the operations building before most lights came on, and often left after the parking lot had emptied. Her desk drawer held handwritten field notebooks filled with careful block letters, route diagrams, and contingency plans drafted long before anyone thought to ask for them. When spoken to, she held steady eye contact, not confrontational, Not defiant, just unwavering. It unsettled people who were used to louder forms of authority. On her right shoulder, she wore a faded combat patch from a previous unit. The stitching had softened from repeated washes, but she never replaced it. At the officers' club, laughter moved across polished floors in the evenings, groups forming easily around shared stories of field exercises and promotion boards. Claire rarely attended. Instead, she sat in her office reviewing maintenance readiness reports, tracing breakdown patterns, recalculating parts requests that would prevent future delays. Down the hallway, someone once called her the supply princess, the words followed by low laughter. She heard it and didn't react. On Sunday evenings, she called her father, a retired army mechanic who still kept his tools arranged with quiet pride in his garage. They talked about engines, about discipline, about doing a job correctly even when no one applauded it. She still folded her uniforms with the same precision she had learned as a private. Corners aligned, creases sharp. Old habits weren't habits to her. They were standards. Inside one of her journals, tucked between operational notes, was a folded list of names. Soldiers from her convoy in Afghanistan. One name had a small star beside it. She didn't keep that list out of grief alone. She kept it as a reminder of what mistakes cost. Claire didn't crave recognition. She didn't measure her worth by how often her name appeared in briefing slides. She demanded competence from her soldiers, from her peers, and most relentlessly, from herself. Because in her mind, leadership was never about who spoke the loudest. It was about who made sure everyone came home when the room went quiet. The morning after the briefing room incident, it didn't become a loud scandal. It became something quieter, which somehow made it worse. No one confronted the staff officer who had blocked the door. No one questioned why a captain tied to readiness had been left standing in a hallway. The meeting ended, chairs scraped, and the same men who had walked past her on the way in now walked past her on the way out, eyes forward as if her presence had been temporary weather. Claire returned to her office without a word, set her notebook on the desk, and opened her laptop. If the battalion wanted to treat her like background noise, she would still make sure the mission didn't stumble because someone ignored the numbers. The air assault training exercise was less than 3 weeks away, the kind of event that pulled every section into a single strain of pressure. It wasn't just aircraft and infantry moving across a map. It was fuel arriving at the right time, ammunition staged in the right order, maintenance crews synchronized with flight schedules, chow delivered when the last chalk landed, and medics positioned where heat and exhaustion would hit first. It was also Kentucky weather, which never asked permission before it changed. Claire had been tracking forecasts for days. A storm system was creeping in from the west, and the models were inconsistent enough to be dangerous. Some showed heavy rain. Some showed high winds. A few showed a narrow window of calm that could disappear within the hour. During the first planning session, she raised it in the calm, flat tone she used when something mattered. Her notes were in front of her, written by hand. She didn't read them like a script. She spoke like someone who had already run the numbers through her mind at night, over and over, until they stopped feeling like figures and started feeling like consequences. "We need to adjust convoy movement times if winds hit above threshold," she said. "If aircraft ground, supply will back up and we'll lose staging control. I recommend we preposition fuel bladders and set up alternate pallet loads for quick reconfiguration." Across the table, Major Denton, the operations officer, listened with a face that stayed polite but slightly impatient. He let her finish the first part, then lifted a hand as if closing a door. "We'll let operations handle tactical decisions," he said. "Not unkindly, not loudly, just final." Claire looked at him steadily and gave a small nod. She didn't argue. She didn't repeat herself. She simply made a note in the margin of her notebook. the way someone records a choice that will matter later. Around the table, a few officers exchanged quick glances. Someone clicked a pen. A captain from one of the infantry companies leaned back as if relieved the logistics section had been put back in its place. Claire returned to her desk and kept working. The plans still needed to be built, even if her warnings were treated like extra weight. 2 days later, she was asked to provide convoy safety recommendations for the slide deck. She submitted them with attached risk assessments, alternate routes, and contingency steps if heavy rain flooded low crossings. She included a simple timeline showing how a single delay could ripple into aircraft scheduling, recovery operations, and refueling cycles. It was clean. It was detailed. It was written like someone who had learned the hard way that uncertainty was not an excuse. When the draft slide deck circulated, her recommendations were gone. Not shortened, not edited. Removed. Her section had been replaced with a single bullet point that read, "Standard convoy procedures will be followed." Claire stared at the screen for a long moment, then printed the deck and set it beside her notebook. She didn't storm down the hallway. She didn't email the battalion commander. She didn't call anyone out. She simply kept her original recommendations close, as if she could hold them in place through sheer discipline. Later that afternoon, she passed an open office door and heard voices inside. "Logistics always overcomplicates things," someone said, followed by a low laugh. "They see a cloud and start drafting an apocalypse." Another voice replied, "Yeah, it's like they want a problem just so they can solve it." Claire kept walking. Her steps stayed even, but the muscles in her jaw tightened slightly, the kind of small tension most people would miss. In Afghanistan, she had learned that emotional reactions were a luxury. The mission didn't pause because someone disrespected you, but disrespect in a peacetime hallway carried its own kind of weight. It didn't threaten life the same immediate way. It threatened something slower and deeper. Trust. At the next coordination meeting, she arrived early and took her seat, notebook open, pen aligned with the corner of the page. One by one, junior officers drifted in, talking in low voices, smiling at private jokes. She noticed them glance at her, then away. A lieutenant near the back leaned toward another and began speaking in an exaggerated, slow tone, mimicking the measured way Claire often briefed. He drew out words the way she did, slowed his cadence as if her composure were something amusing. The second lieutenant beside him covered his mouth to hide the grin. Claire didn't look up. She wrote a single line in her notes. Then she turned the page. When she stood to brief her section, she spoke with the same steady rhythm she always used. Fuel requirements, load plans, maintenance timelines. No extra emphasis, no search for approval. As she spoke, she caught a few eye rolls, small and quick, practiced like habits. When she finished, a soft murmur moved through the room. Not applause, not criticism, just noise that avoided meaning. Then, as she sat down, a ripple of laughter rose near the back. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough to remind her that the room had already decided she was an outsider. As the days moved closer to the exercise, the disrespect sharpened into patterns. Emails about planning sessions arrived late to her inbox, after decisions had already been made. Requests for logistics support came with implied blame, as if her job was to fix problems created by other people's shortcuts. When she raised concerns, she was met with polite patience, the kind offered to someone who talked too much. But Claire kept her posture straight. Her voice never rose. She walked the motor pool in the rain with the maintenance NCOs and checked deadlines the way a commander checks a perimeter. She spoke to supply sergeants with direct respect, knowing they were the ones who made readiness real. In the evenings, while others left, she remained. The building grew quiet, and the hum of fluorescent lights became the only witness to her work. The operational stakes were rising whether anyone admitted it or not. The aviation schedule was tight. Infantry companies were competing to look their sharpest. Higher headquarters would be observing. A delay or failure wouldn't just embarrass someone. It would mark the battalion as unprepared. And the weather kept threatening. The forecast shifted again. Wind warnings, a chance of thunderstorms, a narrow window of calm that could vanish. Claire built contingencies anyway. She prepared alternate staging areas, drafted load reconfiguration plans, and coordinated with maintenance to ensure spare parts were positioned where they would actually be needed, not where it looked convenient on a map. Each step was quiet. Each step was deliberate. One afternoon, walking past the briefing room, she paused. The memory of standing outside that closed door returned with surprising sharpness, not out of pride, but because of what it represented. The way the Army could sometimes forget its own values when personalities and power took over. She looked at the door for a moment, then kept walking. What would you have done in that hallway? Would you have demanded entry or walked away? 2 nights before the final rehearsal briefing, she stayed late. The building was nearly empty. Rain had returned, tapping softly against the windows like a steady reminder that nature didn't care about calendars. Her phone buzzed around 9 in the evening. It was a text from Staff Sergeant Okafor, her junior supply sergeant. "Ma'am, quick question. Did they move the rehearsal brief to tomorrow at 0800? I didn't see you on the updated DRO." Claire stared at the message, then opened her email. The rehearsal briefing notification was there, time-stamped earlier that afternoon. Updated distribution list attached. She opened the attachment. Her name wasn't on it. She scrolled slowly, as if her eyes might have missed it. Then again, still not there. A strange calm settled over her, the kind that comes right before something breaks or hardens. She sat back and looked at the screen. It wasn't an accident. Not after the hallway. Not after the missing recommendations. Not after the jokes. This was intentional. The insult was no longer subtle, it was procedural. She typed back to Okafor. "Copy. Thanks for the heads up. Stay ready?" Then she closed the laptop gently and looked at the notebook on her desk. The pages inside were filled with the work of someone who had treated this mission like it mattered, even when others treated her like she didn't. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a low sound that felt less like weather and more like warning. Claire picked up her pen and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of her notes. "If they won't let me brief it, I'll make sure it doesn't fail anyway." She capped the pen, stood, and turned off the light. In the hallway, her footsteps echoed alone as she walked toward the exit, knowing that tomorrow morning she might be left outside another door. But she also knew something deeper than frustration. The mission never cared who was liked. It only cared who was ready. The motor pool was already loud when Claire stepped onto the concrete, engines idling in staggered lines as mechanics ran final checks before the exercise. Rain from the night before had left shallow puddles that mirrored the gray morning sky, and soldiers moved between vehicles with clipboards and torque wrenches. She walked the line without an escort, hands behind her back, eyes catching details most people missed. Near the third truck, a young specialist had his rifle sling hanging loose against his plate carrier. Not wrong enough to draw immediate attention, but not right either. Claire stopped beside him. "Specialist," she said quietly. He snapped to attention. She reached forward without hesitation, tightened the sling with quick, efficient movements, and rotated the weapon slightly to show how it should sit for stability and quick transition. Her hands moved with practiced familiarity, not textbook knowledge. "There," she said. "You want it high enough to clear when you move." The specialist blinked. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at her differently after that, as if trying to place something he hadn't seen before. Word traveled quietly through the ranks, not as gossip, but as observation. Logistics officers didn't usually adjust rifles like that. Later that afternoon, Claire stood near a maintenance table reviewing her leather notebook while aviation crews prepared for lift coordination rehearsals. The wind carried the sharp smell of fuel and wet metal across the tarmac. Chief Warrant Officer Prescott from the Aviation Battalion approached to confirm fuel sequencing. As Claire turned a page, the inside flap of her notebook shifted just enough for him to see faint stitching along the inner cover. Atlas. The thread was old and slightly frayed, nearly blending into the leather. Prescott paused for half a second longer than necessary. He didn't comment. He didn't ask. But he looked at her again, this time with a subtle recalculation behind his eyes. Atlas wasn't a logistics nickname. It sounded like something earned under pressure. During a coordination session later that week, a staff planner projected aerial route overlays onto the wall. Most officers watched with polite interest. Claire leaned forward slightly in her chair. When the planner mentioned an alternate approach route, she raised her hand gently. "If you shift the corridor 10 degrees west, you avoid that low ridgeline," she said. "The crosswinds there can shear heavier birds off a stable approach." The planner blinked. "That's correct," he said after checking his notes. "We adjusted for that in Afghanistan once. Similar terrain." Claire nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. The room grew quiet in a different way than before. Not dismissal, curiosity. How did the logistics officer know aviation approach corrections from memory? No one asked directly, but glances were exchanged and pens paused above notepads. A few days later, during a field inspection in damp grass beyond the staging area, Claire rolled her sleeves slightly while reviewing a checklist with a maintenance sergeant. The movement exposed a thin scar along her forearm, pale against her skin and unmistakably old. It wasn't dramatic or jagged. It looked like something left by metal and chaos, healed without ceremony. The sergeant's eyes lingered on it for a second before returning to the checklist. He didn't ask. He simply adjusted his posture. Rumors began in fragments, carried in low voices near supply cages and maintenance bays. She deployed more than once. Someone said she ran convoys downrange. Nothing was confirmed. Nothing was denied. Claire did not volunteer stories. When soldiers asked about Afghanistan, she redirected the conversation back to maintenance deadlines or fuel loads. When junior officers tried to place her past within neat categories, she offered them nothing to hold on to. The mystery deepened, not because she hid it deliberately, but because she refused to perform it. During helicopter launch rehearsals, Claire stood near the edge of the staging field as rotors began to spin. The air thickened with noise and dust, and the sky vibrated with controlled force. Most officers watched the aircraft with visible pride or excitement. Claire watched differently. Her eyes tracked lift angles and wind drift, calculating weight shifts instinctively, studying how the birds adjusted against gusts that threatened to push them sideways. There was something else in her gaze, too, something quieter. Not awe. Memory. When a helicopter banked slightly to compensate for crosswind, her jaw tightened just barely, as if recalling another sky in another country, where similar winds had meant something far more dangerous, Chief Prescott noticed. So did a young lieutenant standing 2 rows behind her. By the end of the week, the tone around Claire had shifted from ridicule to uncertainty. The laughter had thinned. The eye rolls had slowed. In their place was a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Who exactly had they locked out of that room? Claire never offered the answer, looked undecided. Low clouds hung over looked undecided. Low clouds hung over Fort Bragg like a heavy lid, and the wind moved in steady pulses that rattled signs and tugged at loose straps on gear laid out for inspection. By 0600, the staging area was already alive with movement. Soldiers carried rucks and cases across wet grass. Ground guides shouted over engine noise. Aviation crews moved with clipped efficiency, checking fuel, inspecting blades, calling out numbers that sounded routine until you understood what mistakes could cost. Claire arrived early and stood near the logistics staging lanes, watching the flow like a quiet conductor. She had the rehearsal timeline memorized, not to impress anyone, but because time was the first thing that broke when plans collided with reality. The first sign of trouble came with the wind. It shifted sharply, not the gentle drift that had been forecasted, but a gusting crosswind that hit the airfield from the side and turned the rotor wash into a violent sideways surge. Dust and moisture whipped into soldiers' faces. A crew chief raised a hand to signal a pause, and 2 helicopters delayed startup, waiting for the gusts to settle. They didn't. Then the rain returned, not as a drizzle, but as quick, hard bursts that slapped against helmets and darkened uniforms. The slick sheen on the tarmac grew brighter. Grass at the staging lanes turned to mud. In the operations tent, planners leaned over laptops and radios, faces tight, voices layered in growing urgency. Weather warnings scrolled across screens. Aviation constraints were updated. The margin for error shrank with each new gust. Claire stood just outside the tent, letting the storm speak for itself. Inside, Major Denton was already irritated, the kind that comes from feeling authority threatened by something as uncontrollable as the sky. He snapped at a staff captain, asked the same question twice, then demanded to know why the rehearsal couldn't simply proceed on schedule. The answer was simple, but no one wanted to say it out loud, because aircraft didn't care about confidence. They cared about physics. By 0730, the miscalculation surfaced, not in a dramatic announcement, but in the slow unraveling of a timeline built on assumptions. Aviation called for updated load sheets to confirm weight distribution. The supply section reported staging was complete. Operations confirmed movement time. Then someone noticed the pallets. The critical ammunition pallets that were supposed to be staged in the first wave were sitting in the wrong lane. Not just one, several. They had been moved earlier that morning when operations adjusted the chalk sequence without informing logistics in time. A minor change on a slide deck had become a major problem on the ground. The pallets now sat behind other cargo, blocked by equipment that would take 20 minutes to shift in the rain. 20 minutes was enough to collapse the window. Aviation crews began recalculating weight limits, and the numbers came back ugly. The wind gusts had pushed the risk margin for lift. The birds could not safely carry the planned loads with the current distribution. A crew chief leaned into the tent, rainwater dripping from his helmet brim. "We're overweight," he said. "Not by a little." The tent went still for a moment, as if everyone needed time to process the idea that the rehearsal might fail before it even began. Major Denton turned sharply, eyes hunting for a target. "How is ammo staged wrong?" he demanded. "How does logistics miss something like this on a rehearsal day?" No one spoke. The silence thickened, not respectful, but tense. Claire stepped inside quietly, shoes leaving damp marks on the tent floor. She didn't rush. She didn't push past anyone. She simply appeared, notebook in hand, face calm, in a room full of tightening expressions. Denton saw her, and the frustration in his eyes sharpened. "This is a logistics oversight," he said, voice rising slightly. "We're about to lose the schedule because pallets are staged wrong and aircraft loads are overweight." Claire didn't flinch. She glanced at the load board, then at the staging diagram pinned to the side of the tent. Her eyes moved with fast precision, like someone reading a familiar language. She didn't ask for a chair. She didn't ask for permission. She turned a page in her notebook. "Sir," she said, "steady." The pallets were moved when chalk sequencing changed. Denton opened his mouth as if to argue. Claire continued, her tone firm but respectful. We can correct it without shifting the entire staging lane if we adjust Chalk 3 and redistribute pallet loads across Chalks 1 and 2. A captain near the radio frowned. That's not on the current plan. It's on mine, Claire said, not sharply, just plainly. She set her notebook on a folding table and opened it to a tabbed section. The pages were covered in handwritten load configurations, each labeled with aircraft types, weight thresholds, and alternate distribution options based on weather restrictions. It wasn't generic planning. It was specific to this exercise. The tent felt quieter. Claire pointed with the tip of her pen. Chalk 3 was scheduled to carry 2 ammunition pallets and 1 water load, she said. In these wind conditions, that puts us above safe threshold. If we move 1 ammo pallet forward to Chalk 1 and shift the water load to Chalk 2, we stay under limit. Chalk 3 carries lighter cargo and maintains lift stability. Chief Warrant Officer Prescott stepped closer from the far end of the tent. He studied her notes, eyes narrowing as he checked the math. Claire didn't pause. Chalk 1 has margin if we remove the secondary equipment crate and push it to ground transport after lift. Chalk 2 can absorb the water load if we reduce 1 accessory package and stage it for later. Denton stared at her, caught between irritation and disbelief. That's going to change the entire timing, he said. Claire shook her head once. No, sir. We maintain schedule if we execute the shift now. 10 minutes of movement, no more. If we keep the current configuration, we lose the entire window and the rehearsal becomes a reset. A staff captain leaned in. How do you know the weight margins without the sheet? Claire didn't smile. Because they haven't changed, she said quietly. The aircraft limits didn't suddenly move. The plan did. Prescott nodded slowly, almost to himself, then spoke. She's right. This keeps us within threshold. The words landed in the room like a small shock. For a moment, everyone seemed to forget the rain and the wind outside. The only sound was a distant radio crackle. Major Denton looked around as if expecting someone to object, to restore the old order where Claire's input could be dismissed. But no one spoke. Several officers were staring at her notebook with reluctant respect. Claire met Denton's eyes, not challenging him, not trying to win. She looked like someone trying to save time. She did not say, "I warned you." She did not say, "You should have listened." She said, "Sir, if we adjust Chalk 3 and redistribute pallet loads, we maintain schedule." Denton's jaw tightened, and for a split second it looked like pride might overtake reason. Then another gust slammed into the tent wall, making the canvas shudder as if the weather itself demanded a decision. Denton exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said. "Execute." The tent sprang back to life. Runners moved fast, shouting load changes. Radios crackled with new instructions. Soldiers sprinted through mud, shifting pallets with forklifts and manpower, rain soaking their sleeves and streaking down their faces. Claire stepped out into the storm without hesitation, walking straight to the staging lanes as if she had always been the one directing them. She approached the forklift operator and spoke in a clear, controlled voice. "We're moving that pallet to lane 1. Watch your turn radius. Keep it tight. We don't have room for a slide." The operator nodded and followed her without question. Nearby, a young lieutenant watched her for a moment, then leaned toward another officer and said quietly, "I heard she ran convoy routes in Kunar province," as if speaking the words made them more real. "Had this planned," he said quietly. "Not had this planned," he said quietly. Not quite a question. Claire kept her eyes on the movement. "I planned for delays," she answered. "Delays happen." Prescott glanced at her, rain streaking across his face. "Most people don't plan this far ahead," he said. Her response was simple. Most people haven't watched a convoy stop moving in the middle of nowhere. Then she said no more. They finished the redistribution in under 12 minutes. The new load sheets were confirmed. The aircraft stayed within limits. The timing held. When the first helicopter lifted, the wind hit it hard, but it stabilized quickly, rising above the tree line like a heavy machine refusing to be pushed off course. Soldiers watched from the ground, some with relief, some with quiet surprise. Back in the operations tent, the mood had changed. The chatter was gone. The frustration had faded into something more cautious. Major Denton stood with arms crossed, staring at the updated plan, his face unreadable. He didn't thank Claire. He didn't apologize. But he didn't dismiss her either. An infantry captain who had once rolled his eyes during her briefings now studied her like he was trying to understand what he had missed. Claire returned to her place near the edge of the tent, notebook tucked under her arm, uniform damp, posture unchanged. She had not taken the moment for herself. She had taken it for the mission. And yet something subtle had shifted around her. Not celebration, not admiration, just the first crack in the certainty that she was only logistics. The storm still hadn't passed, and the day still had plenty of time left for new mistakes to surface. But the room that had once laughed at her now watched her with a different kind of attention, as if they were finally asking the right question. Not whether she belonged, but what exactly she had already survived. The storm had begun to thin, though the wind still pressed hard against the canvas walls. Helicopters continued their rotation, lifting in controlled intervals as the adjusted load plan held steady. Claire stood near the edge of the map table, flipping her notebook closed as the last correction was confirmed over the radio. Mud clung to the edges of her boots. Her sleeves were still damp. That was when Colonel Ray Stafford stepped inside. He had been outside moments earlier, watching the redistribution from a distance without inserting himself. Unlike commanders who preferred to dominate a scene, Stafford had a habit of observing first and speaking last. He removed his patrol cap slowly and glanced at the updated board. "Who authored the alternate load configuration?" he asked, voice level, almost conversational. For a second, no one answered. Major Denton shifted slightly but did not speak. Claire stepped forward, posture straight. "Sir, Captain Harmon," she began formally. "I drafted the contingency." Stafford lifted a hand gently, not to silence her, but to clarify something for the room. "Captain Harmon wrote convoy survival doctrine that was adopted in eastern Afghanistan," he said calmly. The tent went still. Rain tapped softly against the canvas. A radio crackled near the entrance, then went quiet. Stafford continued, tone steady. "I reviewed her Bronze Star citation personally when she transferred to this battalion. She reorganized a disabled convoy under an IED ambush outside Kunar province and evacuated wounded personnel without losing a single additional soldier." The words were not dramatic. They were factual, but they landed with weight. No one in the tent moved. Chairs that had been scraping earlier were now perfectly still. Officers who had once leaned back casually now stood straighter without realizing it. Eyes shifted downward, not only out of shame, but recalibration. Claire did not look around the room. She kept her gaze forward, expression unchanged. Stafford looked at her briefly, then back at the staff. "If Captain Harmon offers a contingency," he said quietly, "it is because she has already seen what happens when there isn't one." Silence stretched. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was instructive. The silence inside the operations tent lingered even after Colonel Stafford finished speaking. Outside, another helicopter lifted into the gray sky, its blades cutting through damp air with steady force. Inside, something had shifted. Major Denton, who minutes earlier had been directing his frustration outward, adjusted his stance. His shoulders squared and his chin lifted slightly, as if correcting an internal imbalance. The edge in his posture softened into something more measured. Across the tent, junior officers who had once exchanged smirks now found sudden interest in their boots, their notes, the floor. No one laughed. No one whispered. Colonel Stafford stepped closer to the center table and looked directly at Claire. "Captain Harmon," he said evenly, "you will brief this operation." There was no dramatic pause, no build-up, just authority restoring what should never have been removed. Claire nodded once. "Yes, sir." She walked to the front of the tent without hesitation, boots steady against the damp flooring. She placed her notebook on the table, opened it to the marked page, and turned to face the room that had once treated her presence as optional. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not rise. She began with timing, then load distribution, then weather contingencies. She explained the adjustments with clarity and without defensiveness. She referenced aircraft limits and convoy flow as if describing something already complete, not something barely salvaged. No bitterness touched her tone. No satisfaction lingered in her words. She spoke like a leader who understood that correction was part of service, not a personal victory. As she outlined the revised sequence, officers leaned forward to listen, not because they were ordered to, but because they needed to. Major Denton met her eyes once during the briefing and gave a small nod. When Claire finished, she closed her. When Claire finished, she closed her notebook gently. "That maintains lift integrity and keeps us within the window," she said. Questions? There were none. Not because confusion remained, but because clarity had arrived. The tent was filled with a different kind of silence now. Not awkward, not strained, disciplined. It was the silence soldiers offer when they recognize competence standing in front of them. No applause broke the moment. No one rushed forward with praise. No cheers, no theatrical gestures. Just men and women in uniform standing a little straighter than before. Colonel Stafford gave one final nod. "Execute," he said simply. Claire stepped back from the front. She did not look around for approval. She returned to her position near the table, posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in that tent knew something had. Respect had arrived, not loudly, not ceremonially, but unmistakably. It did not need volume. It needed truth. Respect is quiet when it is real. By late afternoon, the worst of the storm had passed. The clouds thinned into streaks, and the final helicopter touched down within the adjusted window, exactly as the revised plan had predicted. The rehearsal concluded without further disruption. Timelines held. Equipment accountability matched. Higher headquarters observers noted the battalion's adaptability under pressure. No one mentioned how close it had come to unraveling. Claire moved through the after-action checks with the same measured pace she had shown all week. She verified fuel tallies, confirmed pallet returns, and thanked the supply sergeants who had executed the last-minute shifts in the rain. Her posture was unchanged, her tone steady. If anyone expected visible triumph, they found none. As the staging area cleared and soldiers dispersed, Major Denton approached her near the edge of the motor pool. The engines had quieted, leaving only the distant hum of generators and the soft drip of rainwater from metal edges. He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. "Captain Harmon," he began, voice lower than usual. She turned to face him, expression neutral. "I should have listened earlier," he said plainly, "and I should not have let you be excluded from that rehearsal briefing. There was no audience, no performance, just two officers standing in damp boots on concrete." Claire held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod. "We all served the mission," she replied. "It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't absolution. It was perspective." Denton seemed to understand that. He nodded once in return and stepped away, shoulders no longer rigid with defensive pride. As the sun dipped lower and cast faint gold across the wet pavement, Claire walked back toward the operations building alone. The same hallway where she had once stood outside a closed door felt different now, though she did not linger there. She never wanted the spotlight. She wanted the plan to hold when weather shifted. She wanted pallets staged correctly when seconds mattered. She wanted young soldiers to move safely through missions that did not forgive mistakes. Recognition had not changed her. It had only corrected the room. Inside her office, she placed her notebook in the drawer and sat for a moment in quiet. Leadership is not proven by volume, but by steadiness under doubt. How many leaders are standing in hallways right now, holding notebooks filled with plans no one has asked to see? How often is quiet mistaken for weakness and preparation mistaken for overthinking? In every unit, there are officers and enlisted soldiers whose names rarely make headlines. Logistics planners, maintenance chiefs, supply sergeants. Prior enlisted leaders who earned their authority long before they wore rank on their chest. They are the ones who think about fuel before the engines start, weight limits before the aircraft lift, contingencies before the storm arrives. Their strength is rarely loud. It is disciplined. It is patient. It is built on lessons learned the hard way. The next time you see someone standing outside the room, ask yourself whether they are being overlooked or simply underestimated, because sometimes the quietest voice carries the most experience. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.